Wealth redistribution is a very contentious topic nowadays, but I think the problem is one more inherent to people's motivations than the economy. That is, people specifically want wealth to be redistributed to them, which, if you think about it, is not really a policy of progress, but pure selfishness made political. In my opinion, what we need to worry about when it comes to wealth redistribution is the extremes. Those who can't afford to pay for even the cheapest rent, and then the super wealthy. Those of you who watched my video on nationalism may already be able to predict how I feel about this issue. The true objective of political theory should be to maximize happiness worldwide. So we should consider that money and material success can only really do so much to bring happiness, and likely holds diminishing returns in the upper extremes of wealth per dollar. I think even the most die-hard capitalist would agree our current system does not support this ideal of maximal happiness, seeing as 18 million people die each year today in the world because of poverty-related causes under world capitalism. The current system tries to reward those who have the greatest perceived value, but the fact is, this has created inequality on a grand scale, and goes far beyond merely incentivizing people to contribute their most to society. We've created this system, which is a recent invention, that can serve to benefit people with large amounts of cash very fluidly, with previously unprecedented amounts of manpower at their service, and we can safely assume that if the system can be used to unfairly benefit them, it will be used in such a way, because we do not have the checks and balances to suit this era of such grand discrepancies of wealth, and we do not fully comprehend or witness the way power structures function, especially where money itself is totally influential in its ability to gain manpower. To put it simply, wealth begets power, which begets even more wealth. You can see this in the example of large corporations lobbying for laws which turn the tide in their favor, or perhaps in supporting the campaigns of candidates who are very anti-corporation, such as Bernie Sanders, who in his recent failure to achieve presidential candidacy, he was ousted by many other candidates who then went and supported Joe Biden. These candidates who supported Joe Biden are doing so because Joe Biden basically would serve the interests of corporate powers where Bernie Sanders would not. Another great example of how corporate power has been skewed is the fact that in the 1950s, the typical CEO in America made 20 times the salary of his or her average worker. But in 2018, the CEO pay at an S&P 500 index firm was about 361 times more than the average worker. Another great example is a movie I highly recommend called The Laundromat. It's on Netflix, and it gives examples of how the super wealthy use shell corporations, which are basically companies with nothing real to substantiate them, in order to completely avoid taxation. Now, I don't associate with any one political party, but I do agree with Democrats in the basic concept that we do need to tax the rich. I mean, if you want my 10-second opinion on right versus left, then while leftist ideals tend to be more in tune with my feelings on what we could do in an ideal reality, right-leaning causes are more grounded in reality as we can currently make sense of it. I do feel that more often I would choose to associate with the conservatives' ideology, because while I appreciate that liberals are trying to move into the future, I don't think they have quite the right set of tools and information required to make such steps. Though if liberals were to say, listen to my ideas about reformatting reality, I would probably associate more with liberal ideology. So, I don't know. Before the comments turn into a big argument about taxing the rich, I have a video in my description that I will link that addresses many of the primary myths behind it. Many people want to call this socialism, but the fact is we've been incorporating socialistic policies in the United States for a very long time, things most people would consider standard. Karl Marx was basically the father of unions and worker rights in general, so socialism today is mostly just a word Republicans use to scare people away from policies they don't like. Now, I understand there is a candidate, Andrew Yang, or a previous candidate, he's no longer running, who wants to distribute wealth in the form of $1,000 a month for every U.S. citizen over 18 as a form of wealth redistribution. This may seem to align with my ideology, especially considering my There Is No Unemployment Crisis video, in which I talk about unemployment being a sign of progress, which can hopefully lead to better different types of jobs, less hours in a work week, and yes, even principles such as UBI. But my take on UBI is very different from Yang's, which again I think gains support from the selfishness of people who may not exactly need the help. Not that I think it's entirely a bad idea. There's a good video on UBI here, which I will link. My idea is more similar actually to Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of giving money only to those who are actually poor, or say Milton Friedman's idea of negative income tax, and that is to help people who are not making living wages. For those who don't know, negative income tax works like this. You take someone who makes less than 30 grand a year and take the difference between 30 grand and their income and cut that amount in half and give said amount to them. So, for example, if someone makes 20k a year, they would get 5k a year from the government. Totally no strings attached. This makes sense, and I'm a strong supporter of eliminating poverty through this kind of method. A lot of people say that poor people are just lazy and will waste the money, but isn't buying a private jet also a waste of money? Not to mention human and material resources being wasted. If you really think poor people will waste their cash, I suggest check out this TED Talk I will link, called Poverty Isn't a Lack of Character, It's a Lack of Cash. People will, if given this money, generally take care of their basic needs first. I mean, I am somewhat sympathetic to this idea that poor people will waste money simply because I am 100% against giving homeless people handouts in the form of cash in the street. Reason being is they should be asking for food. And yes, it's very true that they will then go out and buy alcohol with money you give them. I, myself, was actually homeless for a few days once, and I asked people to buy me milk. I hardly had to beg, because every single time I asked, I was successful, and people understand this. Food is a necessity, money is not. Providing people who are making below living wage a guaranteed basic income, we can make tremendous headway in the vein of maximizing world's happiness levels. Every year, we mourn the loss of lives in 9/11, but just imagine how many lives are lost every day due to lack of food, clean water, and poor living conditions. And these deaths are preventable, perpetuated only by our own selfishness. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't have rich people, but as I said earlier, we simply don't have the controls in our society today to combat wealth's natural ability to build upon itself higher and higher. No single person's contribution is worth thousands more than anyone else's, especially when working class people are not only required for the world to thrive, but also frequently have more than their fair share of challenging work. I'm sure that CEOs have their fair share of work cut out for them as well, but we need to extend the power of the people, just as unions have in the past, to the highest level. And here's the thing, if we don't, we're going to have a huge problem on our hands with a new issue of automation coming up. I watched a video called Obsolete on Amazon Prime Video, which was absolutely terrible in concept because it feared automation rather than embracing it as potentially eliminating the need for everyone to work. But it did make one very good point, actually. It said, when the working class people are all replaced by robots, what power the elites will have over our democracy. They won't need us almost at all. So what place in society may we actually be relegated to? Really, the people have almost no power in society today. We just sit around all day while the super elite exploit the entire planet and live the lives of Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. There are no viable political alternatives to revolution against the mega wealthy elites when this happens and we're all replaced by robots, or else there truly will be no middle class. I feel like this idea does actually give some validity to Marx's vision of a world without economic classes, because if no one or almost no one has to work, and machines are just doing everything for us, then who's to say there should be any differentiation between elites and downtrodden poor? There would just be people, and that is the case. We would have to, if that is the case, we would have to completely rethink the way economies function. I've had an idea, very simple in concept, that may work in this given scenario, but try to take this more with a grain of salt and digest it conceptually rather than actually think about specific details. So we create compounds, which house people en masse. Everyone gets a decently large furnished room to themselves, or if they are a couple, then a shared larger room, which comes supplied with basic entertainment, a somewhat large television, gaming console, computer, though gaming consoles and computers would probably be merged into a single device at this time. And this computer would come packed with all the free digital entertainment that they would need. Every movie, video game, and song ever made completely available for free, along with your reasonable choice of food, and perhaps even a communal area for recreation with things like tennis courts and swimming pools. I think it makes more sense than ever before that today we provide for people in the advent of digital entertainment being free to distribute infinitely many times without any real significant resources required. Everyone would have their basic needs provided for in this model, and if they wanted to further advance in society, they could volunteer themselves for some form of work which may still be necessary. I mean, lawyers, perhaps, will always be necessary in some form, but even a lawyer's job can be less burdensome with the use of computer programs, which greatly reduce the amount of time they have to spend working, while also increasing their efficacy, as seen in a Vice special report called The Future of Work. I think it was sometimes like they were 3 times faster at their job of analyzing contracts and such. There is one big problem with this, and this goes back to what I was saying in the beginning of the video about people being selfishly motivated, and that is materialism. Things like banking, which should really be obsolete in the age of digital money, and my favorite example, which is advertising, something which contributes absolutely nothing in the way of tangible, useful things. Not only are we creating more work for ourselves by demanding more and more things, and by the way, another relevant point to the subject is made in my old video, Taking on Society, Indefinite Production, and Endless Growth, about the constant need to replace things because of planned obsolescence. We're creating worldwide inequality, where Chinese people work in awful conditions to support our thing addiction. And furthermore, we are destroying the environment with more pollution and wasted products that are thrown out before their time. Imagine a world where people don't need to fulfill every selfish materialist desire for things like fancy clothes or furniture or jewelry that costs thousands. We are brainwashed by culture to always be buying more things, like the new car that gets released every year. But in terms of maximizing world happiness, do these things really represent any degree of efficiency? These things are status symbols more than anything, and are the perfect representatives of gross materialism. This is why I'm not actually for a $15 minimum wage unless the nature of jobs themselves change somehow. Just because there is more money in the world doesn't mean we'll have more resources, and that means we will just create greater demand for potentially finite resources, all while creating the need for more jobs in countries like China, where people don't get paid nearly $15 an hour to meet U.S. demands. A policy like $15 an hour minimum wage is just another example of greed in our economy. But again, I see how it could actually make sense if, and only if, we were to reduce the number of hours people work. Really, would people be as poor as they are if they didn't have intrinsic materialistic desires for big houses and fancy cars? I'm not saying that the lower class doesn't have a plight, not at all. Just that we should always put need before greed. We're even brainwashed by saying things like, greed is good. But the thing about that is, greed doesn't care about fairness. Greed only cares about getting ahead. And that's a classic American value that I think needs to be rendered obsolete. I mean, seriously, we have Donald Trump in the White House. I'm not saying he's the worst person ever or anything ridiculous like some people do say about him. But just think about what he truly represents. Capitalistic egoism. Don't listen to the common narrative being spread today. The deck is absolutely stacked against the lower classes of society, and wealth redistribution is a necessary retaliation to the vicious cycle of money granting power, granting more money. The media is owned by those very elitist interests it protects, and the people who refuse to acknowledge the good that could be done and continue to support the current system do so because they themselves are materialists and want to be excessively wealthy themselves, even though most people will not attain this goal. You can probably agree that most of what I'm saying makes intuitive sense. But unless we take control as the people away from the corporations, they are going to be using greed alone to trailblaze our futures. And the costs of being motivated by greed are dire. It has been shown in multiple studies across multiple countries that higher rates of wealth inequality have higher rates, countries with higher rates of wealth inequality have higher rates of homicide, mental illness, imprisonment, high school dropouts, and drug abuse. And the thing about these studies is it wasn't the developed countries with less wealth that were doing worse in them. It was just those with less wealth equality. I want to bring the mean and the median of income closer together. This would mean a generalized linear progression of how wealth is distributed. Currently, it is more of an exponential progression of how wealth is distributed, especially towards the high end of the spectrum. I don't even think there should be such a thing as a billionaire, not until every single person on Earth's basic needs are met. Tupac actually had some great wisdom here, which I will link. There should be limits on things like how large or how many houses you can own. We shouldn't have to pander for every desire the mega-rich have just because they can pay us to do it for them. It's indecent, it's gross, and it needs to change. I have also included some links in the description, including an Adam Ruins Everything video called Billionaire Philanthropy. Check it out. Thank you for watching my video.